All right. Hello, and welcome to the third webinar of our OPI Indian Education for All Background Knowledge series on sovereignty. My name is Jennifer Statham, and I am an Indian Education for All implementation specialist at OPI. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. A reminder that this Thursday we will have our webinar with Senator Morjo. He will be presenting at 4 o'clock. Each webinar will be recorded and participants will remain muted with their cameras off so we can focus on the presenter and their content. A link to the recordings as they are available is on our Indian Ed webpage at the top of the resources page, as well as on your reminder letters that you'll receive before each sovereignty webinar. Please, please, please jot down your questions, put them in the chat. We want to answer your questions. And so we will have a Q&A at the end, but make sure that to put those questions in the chat so we can make sure to address anything that you have questions about. Your feedback on the feedback surveys has brought us this sovereignty series. Please make sure to complete that feedback survey that will be posted at the end of the webinar tonight. Whether you need professional development units, and professional development is the new term for renewal units with our new Teach Montana system, but your feedback really is so valuable, whether you're wanting units or whether you are just a member of the public who wants to know more about tribal sovereignty. Your feedback is just so valuable. And that the surveys are always only open until about 3 o'clock the next day, so make sure to get those surveys back. I am thrilled to introduce tonight's presenter. Wes Martel is Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho from the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. He serves as a Wind River Senior Conservation Associate for the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. Mr. Martel served on the Eastern Shoshone Business Council for 20 years, where he oversaw programs and legislation dealing with water, taxation, energy, and environment. He was chairman of the Fish and Game Committee for the Shoshone and Arapaho tribes, where they instituted sound fisheries and wildlife management planning with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also adopted a tribal game code. His work included developing a severance tax program for the tribes and drafting, approving, adoption of the Wind River Water Code. Wes is a veteran and has a deep and abiding respect for the values and beliefs of his Indigenous people. Mr. Martel, thank you so much for being here. Tos, Bana, welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for putting me in front of such an important group. Here in Wyoming, not too long ago, they also passed the Indian Education Act for All. And the 4 components that they had here for Wyoming were culture, language, history, and governance. And as a tribal leader and having spent 20 years on our business council, I like to focus on the governance side of things. And so water is our most important resource. And back in 1977, the state of Wyoming took the Shoshone and Arapaho tribes into state court. I want to emphasize that, as into state court. They took the Shoshone and Arapaho tribes into state court to adjudicate our water rights here on the Wind River Reservation. And so we're pretty lucky to be from this part of the world. And the Wind River Reservation, we're just a microcosm of Wyoming. Energy development, we're energy producing tribes here. We have several oil and gas fields on our reservation. Agriculture and livestock, we have a lot of people that make their living in agriculture and livestock. Recreation and tourism, government sector jobs, small businesses. So we're just a smaller version of Wyoming here at Wind River. And the reservations in Montana are just about the same way. Most of the reses in Montana are just smaller versions of Montana. Some of them have energy, like Blackfeet. I know Fort Peck used to. You have Northern Cheyenne and Crow with coal. I know Fort Belknap had a copper mine on it at one time, and the Flathead Reservation, they've got control of a major water resource behind Flathead Dam. So there's a lot of areas out there that tribes are into different economic diversification efforts. And so water is the most important part of that. And so I really would like to ask Jennifer, I'll just start off with my slides, and I'd like to get into some of the documents that we are going to demonstrate how we upheld our sovereignty, and get into the PowerPoint slides. Jennifer, please. Okay, I'm gonna kind of just give you a little bit of a quick overview of Wind River Reservation sovereignty. And as you look at all the various tribes, and for the work that we do as a Greater Yellowstone Coalition, we do a lot of interaction with the Rocky Mountain Tribal Leaders Council. And that's the tribes in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. And so that's really an important part of, sharing information, how do we protect tribal sovereignty? And as a tribal leader, you always have to ask yourself, and if you have a treaty, you have to ask yourself, how do I breathe life into my treaty? And as a person that sat on our Eastern Shoshone Business Council for 20 years, you really have a responsibility and obligation as a tribal leader. And that goes for any government, any county, state, school board, or whatever else. You have a real obligation to learn what you're dealing with, to understand the issues of your tribe. And so, like, again, a lot of the tribes in Montana, agriculture and livestock, energy, recreation and tourism, fisheries and wildlife. There's a lot of areas there that connect with not only other tribe, but with the state of Montana and with our region. Tribes are major parts of the economy, or the economic value of the region, because they have a lot of payrolls. They have tribal payrolls. They have Bureau of Indian Affairs payrolls. They have school payrolls. So they're a major part of the economy. So here at Wind River, we're very unique, and we have two separate tribes here at Wind River, and we have one government. And we don't have a constitution here at Wind River. No constitution. We're the same size as Yellowstone Park. We're 2.5 million acres. And like I said, we're energy producing tribes. We started, one of the earliest fields here on Wind River was the Lander field, which started over a little town over here called Lander, Wyoming. And we started oil and gas here in 1891. So the Shoshone and Arapaho tribes here at Wind River have been in the oil and gas business for quite a while. And, over the years, that's been a source of revenue for the tribes. We get a dividend check out of that, out of the royalties every month. And just in recent times, the price of gas and oil has gone up. So revenue has been fairly stable for the tribes here in just the past couple of years. So when you look at that, and there's even some fields here on our reservation that are fracking right now. And then we have a lot of abandoned wells, oil and gas wells. There are hundreds of oil and gas wells out there that have just never been properly abandoned. Companies just left them. They didn't plug them and, handle them properly. So there's a lot of areas that, how's that impacting our water? Some of these energy companies, they dispose of their wastewater on the surface. So they got little creeks running down some of our valleys up here. That's wastewater from energy producers. We have an adjudicated right, even though we lost about 2/3 of our water. And remember, I mentioned that we were taken into state court. On an average year here at Wind River, on our 4 major drainage basins we have about 1.3 million acre feet of surface water on the Wind River Reservation. The state courts and special master determined that out of that 1.3 million acre feet of surface water, the Shoshone and Arapaho tribes, we're entitled to 500,717 acre-feet of water. And an acre foot is how they measure water here in most of the West. It's 1 acre, an area of 1 acre, with water on it, 1 foot, 1 feet deep, 1 foot. 1 foot of water on 1 acre. It's like 326,000 gallons, 1 acre foot of water. So out of our 1.3 million acre feet, we were awarded 500,700, about 38% of the surface water. And then the courts and special master also said, we have no reserved right to groundwater, which is another violation of all federal precedences of Indian law and the Winters Doctrine. We have a lot of fisheries and wildlife here at Wind River. We have all the same wildlife as Yellowstone. In fact, we're getting a lot more grizzlies and wolves in some of our mountain country on our northern boundaries and our western boundaries now because of what's happening all around us. Decreasing habitat and slaughtering wolves in certain states, and the constant pressure upon wildlife and their habitat. We have 1,108 miles of rivers and streams, and we have 265 lakes here in our reservation. So, those are important areas. There's pure streams of golden trout in some of those lakes, Yellowstone cutthroat here and there. We have a fish called burbot, which is a ling in one of our lakes. And so, we've been working with the Fish and Wildlife Service for several decades now to have fisheries and wildlife management plans for the Wind River Reservation. Next slide. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I'm trying.
All right.
There we go. Okay.
All right. Okay, so under the Bighorn adjudication, before the court even came up with our final award, we made the determination that we better have a tribal water code. If we're gonna protect our treaty rights and our water rights, and if we're going to try to protect water based on our cultural values and beliefs, state water law isn't going to get it for us. So right when we're going through the final stages of this case, it went to the state district court. And the reason it got to go to the state court, because back in 1953, Senator McCarran from Nevada introduced what they call the McCarran Amendment. And the McCarran Amendment waives the sovereign immunity of the United States, so federal water rights can be taken into state courts. And initially, when they adopted the McCarran Amendment, Indian reservations were not included in there. It was all federal lands, Forest Service lands, BLM lands, Park Service lands, federal lands that had water. And so that amendment waived the sovereign immunity of the United States so that they could be taken into state courts. And then in 1985, in a Supreme Court case, San Carlos Apache versus California, that's when they put reservation under the McCarran Amendment. So not too long after, that's when Wyoming was able to drug us into state courts. And so that's an area of real serious consideration from tribes. We'd rather have our water rights taken into federal courts, which was the way it used to be. And if you really think about it, for tribes, state courts, they're like the enemy. And they acted like the enemy in our case. They took 2/3 of our surface water and said we have no reserve rights to groundwater. And then they limited us to one use. So I talked to a good friend of mine that used to work for an organization called the American Indian Resources Institute out in Oakland, California, a guy named Dick Trudell. And I told him, I said, hey, Dick, I said, we're getting to the end of our water rights case, and we think we should try to put together a tribal water code. And we were one of the first tribe to actually undertake that full process of developing a tribal water code. And a couple of weeks later, he called me and he said, well, Wes, he said, I've got 5 people I'm going to send up to you. I'm going to spend a couple of weeks with you guys and help you understand the major areas of a water code and how to start putting it together. And so the 5 people that he sent up was Dr. Charles Wilkinson from University of Colorado, Boulder. Charles is a expert on federal Indian law and federal water law, and done a lot of work with federal agencies. And he was one of the attorneys that he sent up. And the other one was Dr. David Getchus. And Dr. David was the original director of the Native American Rights Fund before John Echohawk took over. So David Getchus, he also was an expert on federal Indian law and federal water law. And Getchus was the Colorado State water engineer for about 10 years. So he understood that side of it. And then he sent up a hydrologist and 2 economists. And so we had a 5-member dream team. Charles, David, the hydrologist was Dr. Catherine Vandemore. She had a doctorate degree. She had a bachelor's degree in geology. She had a master's degree in hydrology, and she had a doctorate degree in watershed management. So the light bulb finally went on for me about the importance of technical information in protecting and fighting for your water rights. And so then he also set up 2 economists, Dr. Bonnie Colby, and she's still working on Indian water. She's from University of Arizona in Tucson, and then a guy from San Francisco named Zach Willey. And Dr. Colby was an ag economist, and Zach, he was like kind of the area here for, recreation and tourism and other things that go on in Wyoming and our region. And so what Dr. Charles and Dr. David drilled into this little tiny brain is that the 4 major components of developing a tribal water code are the policy making, the legal side, and the Winters Doctrine must always be the standard by which we uphold our water rights. Then there's a technical side of it, and there's the administrative side of it. So those are, very critical components of putting a code together. Next slide, please. Here at Wind River, like I said, we're very unique here at Wind River. We have each tribe, Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho, have a general council. And these are all the people 18 years and older. And each tribe has a business council. So there's 6, the Eastern Shoshone have a 6-member council, and then the Northern Arapaho have their own 6-member council, and they have separate programs. We have separate tribal offices, and we have separate casinos, separate businesses, and so we're very separate in that way. But we also have the Wind River Intertribal Council, where both the tribe meeting on joint issues. And there's kind of a history there. This was originally the Eastern Shoshone Reservation. And the Eastern Shoshone Reservation of 1863 was 44 million acres. Our reservation extended from where we are right now in west central Wyoming into Idaho, down into Utah, into Colorado, and back up. The Treaty of 1863, 44 million acres. Then 5 years later, in the Treaty of 1868, our reservation was knocked down to 2.5 million acres. And that's the present reservation we have today in West Central Wyoming. And so our organizational structure is somewhat varied. Each tribe has their own separate program, but like all of the natural resources and water and land, the 50-50% interest. Each tribe has a 50% interest in the reservation. So we have to meet on water, we have to meet on energy, we have to meet on land and some of these other areas that are important to our sovereignty. Next slide. When we after we got done with our dream team of the 2 attorneys and the hydrologists and the 2 economists, we put together our tribal water code. And you have a copy of that on your computer there. Then we'll go through a certain section of that in a little bit later. But when we first adopted our tribal water code, the state of Wyoming took us to the Department of Interior, and they said, well, the Wind River, the Eastern Shoshone, Northern Arapaho tribes do not have a constitution. They have no separation of powers, so they should not be allowed to have any laws. That was the state of Wyoming's position when we adopted our tribal water code. And a bunch of you know what, right? But anyway, so we established our record of everything that we did to adopt our tribal water code. Within an 11-month time frame, when we had discussions on developing the Wind River water code, we had 27 informational meetings and tribal meetings and public hearings within an 11-month time frame. And we have 4 major communities here at Wind River. And as members, anybody that's on a tribal council, it's politics. You know, you're an elected person. And just like any other politics or any other elected official, you have some people that just want to hug you, and there's other people that want to strangle you. You know, so in order to address those people that want to strangle you, you always try to get as much information as you can on what you need to get done. And so the first, we had, like I said, we have 4 major communities. And so as we were preparing to educate our tribal membership through our general council. Remember, I just talked about our general council, all our tribal members, 18 years and older. That's who we had to take our Wind River water code to our general council to get their approval. We didn't want our business council to approve it. We wanted the general council to approve it, because then that's a vote of the people. So in our 4 major communities, we hit them for 1 week, we hit each community. We hit one community Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night. And that first round of informational meetings we talked about the hydrologic cycle of Wind River. And that hydrologist that Dick Trudell sent up to be on our dream team, we eventually hired her to be our tribal water engineer. So we started developing a lot of educational materials about the Wind River hydrologic cycle, 265 lakes, 1,108 miles of rivers and streams, 5 major aquifers under the ground, wetlands, springs, geothermal, every drop of water on Wind River, we tried to identify it, the hydrologic cycle of the rails. And then that was the first week. So the second week, we went back to all 4 communities again, and we talked about the court case. They had Bighorn, and we had our court case was called the Bighorn adjudication. And you had Bighorn 1, Bighorn 2, Bighorn 3, Bighorn 4, Bighorn 5. And so we went to the communities and explained to them each one of those areas of the Bighorn adjudication and how it impacted us. And then the third week we came back through and we had a discussion document. You got the Wind River Water Code in front of you right now, and we took about a 2-page document and just had some bullet points about what this Wind River Water Code was gonna be involved in, that how that was protecting our treaty rights, our water rights, and our culture and our tradition, and exercising our sovereignty wisely. And in Indian law, in our tribal court circles, we have limited areas of jurisdiction especially on the criminal side. You have criminal jurisdiction and you have civil jurisdiction. And the courts and the Congress have severely limited us a lot on the criminal side. We're barely getting back into it under this Violence Against Women's Act. They finally allowing tribal courts to have some criminal jurisdiction over offenders that are violating Indian women. And so there's a little bit of giving tribes a little bit of criminal authority back. But under the civil jurisdiction side of it, we have a lot of opportunity there. Water, taxation, energy, environment. Those all come under the civil arena. And tribes have civil jurisdiction over everybody within the exterior boundaries of their reservation, even non-Indians on fee land. That's a very important distinction. Non-Indians on fee land under civil jurisdiction, we have authority over non-Indians. We had a zoning case here at Wind River when I first got into council back in the mid-80s. It's Knight versus the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes. It's called the Knight case. And we had a non-Indian buy 80 acres of land here on the eastern side of the res, down by a town called Riverton. And he bought that 80 acres and he was going to subdivide it into a bunch of home sites. And so we finally got wind of it, and we had a little resolution, zoning ordinance resolution, and so we took him to court on that resolution. It went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court says, Shoshone and Arapaho tribes, you have zoning authority over everybody within your boundaries, including that man, that non-Indian man who was trying to subdivide that fee land. So that's a real important sovereignty standard for tribes, zoning authority. And water comes under that same authority. We have authority over everybody within our boundary. Taxation is the same way. Right now, the state of Wyoming is taxing our oil and gas just like we are. The Shoshone and Arapaho tribes, we have an 8.5% severance tax on our oil and gas. The state of Wyoming collects a 6% severance tax off of our oil and gas on the reservation. And Fremont County collects about a 7.5% mineral property tax off of every barrel of oil and every MCF of gas on our reservation. Since 1969, the state of Wyoming and Fremont County have collected over $500 million in taxes off the Wind River Reservation. And then, and a lot of times here in this area, you always hear the non-Indian community and business people saying, well, Indians don't pay taxes. Well, guess what? Here at Wind River and in Fremont County, we're the highest taxpayers in Fremont County, the biggest taxpayers. They should not be taxing our resources. That $500 million that they've collected, I think we've got a claim against that. But again, utilizing our sovereignty and our authority. So when the state challenged us and said, we have no separation of powers and we have no authority to adopt laws. And at the time, they were right. We did not have a separation of powers. Well, back in the early 80s, the mid 80s, we adopted a tribal severance tax. Finally, in the 80s, right? Wyoming's, they started theirs back in '69. But anyway, when we adopted our severance tax, we converted our BIA Court of Indian Offenses into a tribal court to uphold tribal law and ordinances. And then we designated the Wind River Intertribal Council. That's both councils together, meeting on joint issues. Remember, I talked about water, land, energy, taxation, zoning. Those joint issues, we meet together as a Wind River Intertribal Council. That's the two councils together. And so we designated them as the executive branch. And then in our Wind River Water Code, it's at the top of page, in the Wind River Water Code, go to the top of page 6, if you can, please. Right there, yep. You see at the top of page 6, there's hereby established the Wind River Water Resources Control Board as the primary enforcement and management agency responsible for controlling water resources on the reservation. That statement right there, if you can go back to that last PowerPoint on that slide, where I had the separation of powers. There is hereby established the Wind River Water Resources Control Board as the primary enforcement and management agency responsible for controlling water resources on the reservation. We are delegating, and we took this water code to the General Council because we wanted it to come from the people. We didn't want it to come from the business council. We wanted it to come from the people. So we took this water code to the General Council, and because of all of the informational meetings, remember I talked about all the informational meetings we had with tribal members and everything. We had a Shoshone General Council meeting. We had 440 members present at that meeting. And when we took a vote to approve the Wind River Water Code, the vote was 439 to 1 to approve the Wind River Water Code. And that's really amazing in Indian country to get that kind of an overwhelming vote in favor of any kind of issue. But again, it was a community education and involvement efforts that we undertook. Remember, I talked about tribal leaders always have somebody that want to strangle them. Well, even some of the people that wanted to strangle us believed what we were doing was the right thing. And so that's sovereignty in action. Our people delegated legislative authority to the Wind River Water Resources Control Board. They have the authority to amend the code, adopt regulations, and then we'll go through this a little bit later. You'll see what the powers are, how we connected the powers to our policies and our purposes and our finding. Here at Wind River, we have several legislative bodies. We have the Wind River Tax Commission. They're the primary, management and enforcement agency for taxation. We have the Wind River Environmental Quality Commission. They're the primary management and enforcement agency for the environment. And every tribe has to have a TEPA, a Tribal Environmental Policy Act, patterned after NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Because then anybody that comes onto the res, if they're doing anything on the reservation, any activity, they have to fill out a permit. So tribes have a good accounting of who's using land, who's using water, who's on the res, what are they doing? We got to keep track of that. And under the environmental arena, tribal authority has really been upheld. Under the environmental area, that's one authority. The United States Supreme Court usually upholds tribal environmental authority, governmental authority. And then a lot of tribes have tribal employment rights ordinances. That's where any contractor that comes to the res has to let us know the amount of their contract, what they're doing, and then they have to hire tribal members, because before we adopted these types of ordinances, contractors would get a contract on a res, bring in a whole crew of outsiders, and none of our people would ever get employment. So we've had to try to protect employment rights on our reservation. So that's another area. And I think that's the last of the slide. Is that the last one?
Yep, it is.
Okay, so when I talked about, remember we had a dream team, and we had Dr. Charles and Dr. David and the hydrologists and the two economists here. And we said the number one component of co-development is the policy making. And we actually never really did that when we developed our tribal water code, because we didn't know. We didn't really know about that phase of it. And so by the time we start getting into this code, we, based on our meeting, we developed some. But this is an important area. And this doesn't, you don't need a bunch of attorneys and consultants and engineers to do this policy making. This is just our tribal elders, our spiritual leaders, our elected leaders, our community, our young people talking about what type of policies do we want to have on our reservation to control, manage, and protect water. So Jennifer, if you could go to the tribal policy making handout, that was in the first one there, I think it was. And I've still got Yankton Sioux on here, but you can cross that out and put Fort Belknap or whoever you're close to somewhere. But I was working on a project with the Yankton Sioux back in South Dakota, and so you ask the average tribal leader about what are your major policies to protect water, and they kind of give you a blank stare. And I know the drill. When I first got elected to our council was in 1979. And in 1977 was when the state of Wyoming took us into state courts. And so when I first got on the council, that's when the Bighorn adjudication was just gearing up. We're just starting to move, and we were having meetings with a whole bunch of attorneys and engineers and consultants and Fed reps and tribal leaders. There'd be 50 people in a room some nights talking about Indian water rights, and I didn't have the slightest idea what they were talking about. And that was pretty scary. Here I am making some decisions that are going to be forever, and I don't really have a good handle on what we're doing here. And then the attorneys, they'll bring in a stack of documents about that thick and say, oh, we need a decision on this by in the morning. And so one night I just finally blew up. I'd just been on the council just a couple months, just a young whippersnapper, still kind of not quite understand what's going on. And I just kind of blew up, and I said, you guys are talking all this stuff. I said, I haven't heard the word Indian one time here. This is an Indian water rights case. This is a white man water rights case. When are we going to start talking about to our Indian people? And I just got up and I walked out of the room. And it was pretty quiet when I walked out of that room, but I got back to my hotel room and I was just sitting there and I was kind of thinking, now what did I just do? And then that's when I was thinking, well, you know what? You've been number one, what you got to do is you got to know what they're talking about. You better start doing your homework and understanding some of these issues. So I took that big old stack of documents. I didn't finish them all up by the next morning, but I started going through them. I'm trying to understand what some of these issues were. And so when they talked about the policy making, that's just us, Indian people, determine what we want. How do we want to control, manage, and protect water? So we came up with this tribal policy making that you have in front of you right now. The number one thing you need to talk about is the major development on your reservation, whether it's Blackfeet, Fort Belknap, Fort Peck, or Crow, Northern Cheyenne, any of those reservations. What kind of existing businesses and development do they have on the right now? And what types of future businesses will they have that will create jobs and economic growth? And so this is just the things that we as tribal people, we need to be talking about this. What do we have? What do we want? What kind of water use is going to be related to this economic growth and development? What's going to be the condition of this water after it's used by developers? How does fisheries and wildlife fit into the picture here of how we want to control, manage, and protect water? What's going on? What kind of location of development in the various watersheds and drainage basins of the reservation? You know, here at Wind River, we've got oil and gas fields. We've got cattle. We've got casinos. We've got hotels. We've got, all, farmland, all in various watersheds. What's going on in the various watersheds and drainage basins of the reservation? And a lot of our elders, when I was in Yankton talking to the elders about this, well, that was some of my favorite times, because the elders would just open up to me and talk about how it was way back and how they used to move and take care of water and how they used to create their gardens and their fields and the power their medicine men had and their Indian doctors and their medicines and their foods and all these things along the rivers that they utilized. And, that's really that's an important information. That's important history that pertains to the policies that we want to make. So what are the harmful impacts of that development? And like I said, here at Wind River, we've got some oil fields where they're fracking out there, some gas fields where they're fracking. Domestic and municipal uses. Domestic is water, a beneficial use of water in our home. And the municipal use is beneficial use of water in our schools, government buildings, other areas like that. And then storage. A lot of reservations have storage already that was built by the BIA or in some cases, some non-Indian irrigation district, which has happened here. So, and now, especially with drought and climate change, those reservations that have areas to build storage, you got to get hot on that, I believe. We've got to make sure our future generations always have a reliable source of clean water. The cultural concerns involving water. The importance of traditional, cultural, and spiritual testimony in litigation or negotiation. This was what was completely missing in our water rights case when we were sitting in the state courts down in Worland, Wyoming, and then eventually Cheyenne, Wyoming. We had no elders talking about the cultural and traditional importance of water. The cultural and traditional testimony we had in our water rights case was some old white anthropologist from Boulder, Colorado. And he just gave some general information. Oh, the Shoshones, they didn't depend that much on fisheries. And so it was just really, now that I know what I know, that was a blatant mistake on our part. I didn't know any better at the time, but we always got to have our elders and our spiritual leaders in front of those judges and special masters talking about our connection to water and all above ground and below ground. Traditional use areas. You know, we have a lot of traditional use areas on our land where we hunt, where we gather, where we hold ceremony. And then even a lot of traditional uses off reservation. In Yellowstone National Park, in Grand Teton, and a lot of public lands all around us. And so when we're talking about water, what's the traditional use areas, the ceremonial uses that we need to protect our water? You know, we want to make sure we're in our sweat lodges, we're able to pour clean water on our rocks. Fisheries, maintaining in-stream flows and the reproductive cycle. You know, most of the time you can go to the Big Wind River in August and you can walk across the river without getting your feet wet because it all is going to agriculture. And so the health of our rivers for indigenous people is the health of us. And so that's why this water code is one of the most important pieces of tribal legislation that'll ever be adopted. In-stream flow. You know, one year, when the case first came out of the district court in Worland, Wyoming, the judge awarded us administrative authority over the entire reservation. And so that included there's 3 big non-irrigation districts that were created by the Reclamation Act back in 1905. And that's where most of our water goes. And so those irrigation districts, when we adopted our tribal water code, I was on the Fish and Game Committee at the time. And so we applied to the Wind River Intertribal Council for an in-stream flow permit below Diversion Dam, which is the diversion structure that takes all of our water out to the non-Indian irrigation districts. And so we applied and were awarded an in-stream flow permit below Diversion Dam for that 1 year in 1991. And the non-Indian irrigation district, boy, they were going nuts. There was letters to the editor. There was people in the headlines and the news. Oh, the Indians are going to burn us out. The Indians are going to destroy the economy. The Indians are taking away our livelihood with this in-stream flow. And so we actually got to leave 252 cubic feet per second of water below Diversion Dam. And it was so good to see that water in our river year round. And at the end of that summer, when the non-Indian irrigation districts tallied up all their crops and their economic value, they had a banner year. In that same year, we left water in the river for in-stream flow. So that proved to us that irrigation districts and in-stream flow can survive together if you do it right and take only what you're entitled to. A lot of these non-Indian irrigation districts and developers, they take way more than they're entitled to. And so that's part of this code. How do we protect that? Excuse me. Sacred sites. The river is a sacred site for us, so that's something we need to protect. Also, the connection of surface and groundwater as a unitary resource. There was a recent case about 3 years ago, the Agua Caliente case in Palm Springs, California, where the Winters doctrine was upheld. Winters' rights were upheld. And they were even upheld in relation to groundwater. The court said the Agua Caliente have a reserved right to groundwater on our reservation. And remember, the special master in Wyoming court said, we do not have a reserved right to groundwater at Wind River. So it was good to see that Winters doctrine upheld relating to groundwater. And as tried, we need to connect that. And the reason I looked at the website for Agua Caliente, and I think the reason that they got that decision was because they really did a good job of including their elders. And they talked about the spirits and beings that are below ground that are connected to the spirits and beings above ground, and how that we affect each other and we support one another and we're connected to them, to that fire that's in the middle of the earth and that water that's there. We're connected to all of that. And they explained, they talked, they stated their name for creator, the agua caliente, about how the creator, provided us all of the natural surroundings above ground and below ground. They talked about the beliefs of they have below ground. And so I think that's why the judge said these people should have that reserve right to groundwater. Item 3, the role of water in a larger tribal context, the importance of having a tribal water code and tribal water management plan before litigation or negotiation. We got drug into court and we didn't figure out till later that we should have a tribal water code. So all the time we were in tribal court, they were talking about state law and federal law, but they never did talk about tribal law because there wasn't any, right? We didn't have a tribal water code. So if you're going to go into litigation or negotiation, you better have a tribal water code. And most of the tribes in Montana have already settled their water rights. They've all signed settlement agreements with the state of Montana and with the United States. The only one that hasn't right now is Fort Belknap. And I know there's a lot of discussion going on right now there by tribal members at Fort Belknap whether they want to sign that settlement agreement or not. And that's an important discussion. Beneficial use. In our water rights case, the state of Wyoming used the Eastern Shoshone Treaty against us. The treaty says the Shoshone Reservation is hereby created as an agricultural reservation. So the state of Wyoming said the only reason the Shoshone and Arapaho tribes should get water is for one beneficial use, and that is agriculture, because that's what it says in their treaty. And so we fell into that trap. I was, like I said, I didn't know anything about water back in those days. I was just basically listening to the attorneys and some of the consultants. And even the BIA back in those days, they had interior solicitors that were giving advice. And then the Justice Department had an attorney there. So we had, a lot of legal people, and none of us knew what the hell we were doing. But anyway, this is really what I think they used to steal 2/3 of our surface water, because we only used it for agriculture. And so we focused a lot of attention on PIA, practically irrigable acreage. And so that's really what limited us, because most of our reservation is mountain country. So out of our 2.5 million acre reservation, they found 104,000 acres of practicably irrigable acreage. And so I think then, so they said, well, all they need is 500,717 acre feet for that one beneficial use. The positive component of that is the fact that we got water for futures land. And under Western water law, that never happens. Use it or lose it applies under Western water law. If you don't use your water on your land, the state water engineer will cancel your permit. But in the case of, at least they recognize that out of that 104,000 acres of PIA, there's about 50,000 acres of that PIA that has not been developed yet. So we were awarded water for that futures land of PIA. So that's an important distinction in Indian water rights. You can see under PIA, I came up with a new term, traditional irrigable acreage. Vegetation, plants, roots, trees, bushes, willows, berries, flowers that are our medicines and our foods that are important in our ceremonies and in our kitchens and in our lodges. That was never ever discussed. You know, sage, cedars, freshwater lilies. You know, there's all these different plants out there and medicines that we have that grow all around us. And we never even talked about having water for the traditional irrigable acreage. And it's not really irrigable, but it's naturally irrigable, but it's still something that has to be considered in terms of water usage. Energy development takes a lot of water, and our oil and gas field using a lot of wind river water. Marketing and leasing. You know, before we adopted our water code, when we first started talking about it, we went to our elders and we told them that we have to have a water code to protect our treaty rights and our water rights. And this is our Eastern Shoshone elders. And we told them that, you know, nowadays there's a lot of people stealing Indian water and claiming Indian water and taking Indian water. And if we don't have a water code, we're not going to be able to take care of it and protect it. And as you can see in item 4 right there, it says marketing and leasing. And that's what we told our elders. We told them, we said, we know that the selling of water goes against our values and beliefs as Indian people. But in order for us to protect our trust resource, which is water, we have to be able to charge people for using it. We're going to have to sell water. And we know that goes against our values. And so we told them, we want you to help us decide what to do with that. So they talked for quite a while, our elders. That we had about 15 of them gathered up one night over at my brother's house. And they talked and they came back. And this was back then, this was in the mid 80s when we were doing this code, and they came back to us and they said, well, back then they called us boys. The elders said, you boys are doing the right thing. You're standing up for our water rights and you're standing up for our treaties. And, you know, the Creator gave us these resources. And, you know, over all these times, we always have to look for new ways to take care of ourselves, provide ourselves. We used to depend on the buffalo for that a long time ago. And now we can't depend on that buffalo. Now, maybe through this water, we're going to find ways to take care of ourselves. So go ahead and put that marketing and leasing in our water code. So that's how we put that marketing and leasing into our code under number 3 there, where we got the approval of our elders. Number 4, establish them a water policy goals, establish duties of water. You know, in our code, we might not have enough time to go completely through this code, but we'll get to some of the beneficial uses. In-stream flow, the top of that next page, clean water is vital to the health and welfare of reservation residents and to the vitality of the reservation economy. That language came out of the Montana versus United States of the Crow case. That was a clear wording in there that upheld Crow sovereignty on that case. Power to determine the proper uses of reservation water and the management thereof is the tribes alone. Land use activities and watersheds and the impact upon water. All waters are reserved by treaty. State law does not apply on the res. All reservations take that stance. State law does not apply. Political issues affecting water management, the lack of awareness of treaties and the Winters Doctrine. You know, most of us don't understand the Winters Doctrine. Most of our tribal leaders today don't understand. Most tribal attorneys don't understand the Winters Doctrine. And the policy making that has to take place. You know, that's the important part. I've seen some of these attorneys, they'll just copy a water code and send it to the tribe. Here's your water code. They don't go meet with the community and the spiritual leaders and the elder to talk about the policies we want this tribal water code to back up. Lack of awareness, state encroachment on lands and jurisdictions. That's happening all the time. No clear policy from the BIA on protecting Indian water rights. The BIA has a weak office. They're the ones pushing these settlement discussions. Tribes have senior rights to water. West of the Mississippi, tribes have senior rights to water. Why are we even in a settlement mode? We should be accepting offers from people on how they're going to respect and reciprocate on Indian water. Indian water is going to give tribes political and economic power that they never ever realized. But we need people, knowledgeable people, right, about tribal sovereignty, about water rights, about the major policies that we want to implement. We need biologists, hydrologists, geologists, all of these, the scientific and technical presence. Because that scientific and technical information backs up our culture and our values and our tradition. And in today's courts, we need that scientific and technical value to back up our culture and tradition. Understanding the negotiated settlement process. All the tribes in Montana have signed a settlement agreement except Fort Belknap. And most of these settlements, you give up your senior right to water. That's because you got attorneys and tribal leaders that don't understand the major issues of water. There's irrigation districts within reservation boundaries and stealing a lot of Indian water. You know, in all of these major basins, in the Colorado River, you know, here in Montana, Wyoming, we're part of the Missouri River Basin. There's 29 tribes on 26 reservations in the Missouri River Valley Basin. What if all 29 tribes in the Missouri River Valley Basin had the same water quality standards? We could play a big role in protecting the Missouri River. And so that's where we're at. We have senior rights to water. With drought and climate change, we got to stand up for ourselves and stand up for our regions and protect water. Identifying like-minded groups and entities who support tribal efforts, and then allottees. On reservations, there's tribal lands, those are owned by the tribe, and there's allotted lands, those are owned by individual tribal members. And so they're entitled to water rights too. So this political tribal policy making exercise we just went through, that's the first important step of how do we want to control, manage, and protect water. And then once you have an idea of that, then you know, let's go to the major issues document. Once you understand the policies, then this is what I needed back in 1979 when we were first talking. I needed somebody to help me understand the major issues of federal Indian Reserve water rights. And so me and one of my brothers that were water warriors, we came up with this list. And all tribal leaders, if all tribal leaders understood this list that we're going to talk about right now, we could be making some major progress in protecting Indian water rights. You know, I talked about the Missouri River Valley Basin all the way down, right? All these dams that are generating hydropower. Well, guess what? A lot of that water generating that hydropower is Indian water. How come tribes don't get any recognition for that? A lot of these developers, irrigation district, that water is a trust resource. It's got to get to the point where the Secretary of Interior tracks every drop of water on our reservation. Who's using it? What are they doing to it? How much are they paying for it? So I want to go through the major issues. Number one, the purpose of the reservation. You got to read your treaty. And remember I said they used our treaty against us here in Wind River. They said the Eastern Shoshone Reservation is hereby created as an agriculture reservation. So they focused on that language and said the only reason Shoshones and Arapaho should get water is for agriculture. But I've seen some other treaties that say permanent homeland entitled to the arts of civilization. Well, if your treaty has that language in there, you're not restricted to being farmers like the Shoshones and Arapahoes. I've seen some treaties that has language that says calculated to advance them in civilization. Again, you're not restricted, right? Resume the pursuits of industry. So you've really got to read your treaty forward and backward. You got to understand. And most of these treaties, especially the 1868 treaties, they're kind of a boilerplate treaty. We all have the same language. But in some of those earlier ones, 1851, 1855, there's other treaties. Some of these reservations have signed, so you have to kind of do some research there. Number two, surface and groundwater. Make sure you don't get into the trap of separating surface and groundwater. That's one resource. Number three, quantification. Winter's rights must apply. This includes all water bordering, flowing through, and flowing under the rev. Winter's rights. The winter's rights case was established on the Fort Belknap Reservation in 1908. And in that case, the Supreme Court determined that since Indian reservations were created to be permanent homelands for people, there's a reserved right of water that goes with that permanent homeland. And so the Winters Doctrine upheld that, the reserved water right, not only to surface water, to groundwater. And under quantification, you have to look not only at PIA, but all the other uses you have for water, beneficial uses. So quantification, and a lot of tribes don't even want to talk about quantification. And so there's a lot of tribes, right? There's 576 federally recognized tribes in the United States. 576 federally recognized tribes. There's only about 3 dozen of us that have done anything to claim our water rights. So there's still 540 tribes out there that have done nothing to solidify or claim their rights. And yet, a lot of these states are using a lot of this water, and that's Indian water. So winners' rights must apply. That must be the standard by which we quantify. Administration is the desired result, tribal administration, federal administration, state administration, or combination of above. Some of these settlements have all three. They have some of the waters administered by the tribe, some administered by the BIA or Bureau of Reclamation, and some is administered by the state. A is the ideal situation for tribe. We got to have tribal administration. 5, marketing and leasing. Tribe should have the right. That's one of our beneficial uses. And so that's another area that we have to have considerable discussion on. PIA, here's the criteria that we used for PIA in our water rights case. PIA should be defined based on local conditions using the following criteria: soils classifications, types of crops, slope of land, climatic conditions, arability, cost-benefit ratio, not ration, cross off the end, efficiency of irrigation project. So that's the 7 criteria we determined to identify that 104,000 acres of PIA we have at Wind River. And as you can see, there's no mention of any traditional type of irrigable acreage in this definition. And so I can kick myself every once in a while for not understanding that and knowing it at this time. All of these issues that we're talking here, these major issues, I knew a little bit about water quality and, beneficial use, but a lot of these other things, and it's completely foreign to me. Okay, historic land. So that was, and then the types of crops was all white man crops: alfalfa, corn, wheat, barley, sugar beets. There's a lot of foods that grow out there that we gather every year that wasn't even mentioned. Traditional indigenous foods. Historic lands, water must be dedicated to all lands presently under irrigation and then futures lands. And I went through that a little bit before. We have land that has not been developed, but it has a water right attached to it, which is a good standard for tribal rights. Priority date. What's the priority date? The priority date for our water here is 1868. Most tribes, they have a priority date around that same time. And that's why I keep emphasizing tribes have senior rights to water. In the Western United States, tribes have senior rights to water. Transfer of use. Tribes must always return the right to transfer use of water from one beneficial use to another. Remember when I told you that our water rights got awarded and we wanted to transfer use of agricultural water to in-stream flow? The state opposed that. But we were able to transfer use of water from agriculture to in-stream flow. Agriculture is the dominant use in most Western states. They use about 95% of the water. And if you want to take, I remember there were some big court cases in Colorado where kayakers wanted to utilize some of the rivers for recreation. And so they had to apply to the state engineer to transfer use of agriculture water to a beneficial use of recreation. And at first, the courts, they denied it. A lot of those kayakers and recreational users in Colorado, they couldn't use it. So they came at them again with another round, and then they finally start realizing how important recreation and tourism are to the economy and allowed that to occur. Item 11, and you must have a tribal water engineer that approves these transfer of uses. Item 11, the Wind River Water Code lists 15 beneficial uses of water. Domestic, that's the water we use in our home. So that's agricultural, industrial, mineral development, groundwater recharge, recreational, religious beneficial use, pollution control, municipal, stock water, in-stream flow, storage, marketing, transfer, cultural, hydropower generation, resource development. So that's the 15 beneficial uses we have in our code. And before I had our code, remember, I tell you, Wyoming just restricted us to one use, agriculture. All surplus water on reservation must be claimed, and a portion of off-reservation water generated from reservation watersheds must also be claimed. Each springtime, the Western states, they make their hydrologic forecasts. And they here in Wyoming and here on the res, we got a lot of measuring devices all over our major basins. And so we can pretty much see each day where our snowpack is. And so are we gonna have like 100% snowpack, which is normal? Are we gonna have 100% of snowpack? Or are we gonna have 50% of snowpack? Or are we gonna have a surplus, which could be 300% of snowpack, which we did have here at Wind River about 5 years ago? How much time do we have left?
We have 15 minutes.
Okay, I better wind it down. Yeah, and so that 300% of snowpack we had that 1 year, man, it melted, and boy, there was a lot of flooding all over the res and areas around them. So once you get storage, you got to claim. We got to complain that you got to claim surplus water. Consumptive use. This is called the depletion amount, but in some of these settlements, like the Fort Peck Agreement, they agreed to 1 million acre-feet of water, which is a lot of water, but they agreed to a 50% consumptive use rate, which means they can only use half of that. So under your hydrologic cycle and your technical water engineer activities, make sure you always try to justify the highest consumptive use rate for your water resources. Storage, number 14, tribes must always retain the right to construct and control on-reservation storage with an 1868 priority date. Water quality, water resources must be administered with a non-degradation policy in mind. The BIA irrigation project in a sad state of disrepair must be rehabilitated and rebuilt. Cultural concerns, the tradition and cultural attachment Indian people have towards water must always be in discussions. These beliefs and the spiritual way of life of Indian people is the reason for our existence. Off-reservation authority, marketing off-reservation, Walton rights. When a non-Indian, remember I said there's individual Indian or tribal members that own land, they can sell their land. So when a non-Indian buys an allotment from a tribal member, they get the same water right, the 1868 water right, as that tribal member, if they put that water to beneficial use in a reasonable time frame. The Wind River Water Code, we went through the beneficial uses, we went through the establishment as the water resources, as the primary management and enforcement agency for the water board. Let's go to the first page here of the water code, page 1 or page 2. Right there, the findings. Here's the findings that we started off our tribal water code with. The tribes find that all reservation natural resources are interconnected, and that the water resource has cultural, spiritual, and economic values that guide the appropriate use, management, and protection of that resource, and that condition all water and land use activities into watersheds and drainage basins of the reservation. And that's just our teachings. As Indian people, indigenous people, our elders, that's the first thing they start telling us: respect nature. Have respect for nature and all that she provides for us. The tribes find that surface and groundwater are directly interconnected by the hydrologic cycle of the region and the reservation, and therefore water is a unitary resource, whether occurring as groundwater, springs, mineral water, soil moisture, precipitation, percolating water, recharge, drainage water, surface water, or otherwise. Every drop of water is connected on this reservation, and we can show that, and we believe that, and that's how we respect it and use it. The tribes recognize that clean water is vital to the health and welfare of reservation residents and to the vitality of the reservation economy. Language out of the Crow case. Because resource uses may contribute to the degradation of water supply and quality, it is necessary to protect the environmental quality and integrity of all surface and groundwater. Very strong statement protecting our water. The number 4 finding, the tribes find that all waters reserved by treaty are held by them in trust for the benefit of the reservation public and for certain inalienable public uses, and that as an essential attribute of sovereignty, the power to determine the proper uses of said waters and the management thereof is the tribes alone. And so all what I've been going through, when Walter talked about the Marshall trilogy, the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination, and Leah talked about her rails and their programs and their attempts at governance. That's the critical part right there. It's what I just explained is Wind River governance. What's Blackfeet governance? What's Crow governance? What's Fort Valdosta? What's Fort Peck governance? What's Flathead governance? What's Rocky Boys governance? What's Northern Cheyenne governance? Students and community members and people from their reservations need to understand their sovereignty. And how do we use that governance to strengthen our families and communities? When I was on our tribal council, that was my major focus. All I'm trying to do is strengthen our families and community. I want them to have food on our table. I want them to have a roof over their heads. I want them to have a warm place to sleep at night. I want them to have jobs where they can take care of themselves and their family. And water is the most important part of that. And so this is sovereignty in action. This is governance. How do we utilize this code to protect the teaching of our elders? How do we utilize this code to educate our young people about Wind River sovereignty? And how do we utilize this code to bring the scientific presence in that we need to protect all that we are fortunate to have here at Wind River and all our other reservations? Most of us tribes in this region were fairly large land-based, with the exception of Rocky Boys and then Little Shell. They don't even have a land base, they just have a tribal headquarters. But most of us tribes, we have some land and we have some resources. What does our treaty say? What does our Constitution say? And how do we create that separation of powers that allows us to exercise tribal sovereignty wisely and with our people in mind and with the coming generations, the next 7 generations in mind? That's governance, that's sovereignty. I thank you for listening.
Wow. So much incredible information. I just my mind is reeling. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, which I would like to see if I can find. Here we go. Why does the tribe sell land to non-Indians when many other tribes are now doing land buyback programs? Also, does Wind River pay both state and federal taxes? It seems unfair from a sovereignty perspective.
Read that first part again, Jennifer. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Why does the tribe sell land to non-Indians when many other tribes are now doing land buyback programs?
Oh yeah, that was the intent of the allotment act. They wanted individual tribe members to get those deeds so they could be turned over to the non-Indian. And a lot of times the counties told the Indian allotment owner, you didn't pay your taxes, so we're taking that land from you. And that was trust land. They didn't have to pay taxes. So once you got that deed, you could do whatever you wanted. And unfortunately, some tribal members sold their land. You know, I worked on a reservation. Their reservation is 300,000 acre reservation. 85% of their reservation is in fee ownership. Out of the 15% of their reservation that is in trust, 9% of that is allotment, and only 6% of that is tribal. So that's what the Allotment Act did to us. That was one of the intents. And so, yeah, just like any other landowner, if you want to sell your land, you can. But the overall intent behind it was not good. And so, you know, so when it comes to taxation, tribes, we've got to have the same tax program as the state and county. So we preempt all of their taxes. All of our reservations are in Montana are collectively losing tens of millions of dollars a year because the state and county is taxing railroad lines, cell towers, computer cables, all of these fee property and on reservation. If there's fee land on the reservation, the county taxes that. And that fee owner pays the property tax on his house, his cattle, his RV, all his property. So tribes are losing out on nationwide hundreds of millions of dollars a year because other jurisdictions are attacking our tax base.
Someone is asking, can we share this with our tribal officials? And, you know, yes, anything in the resource folder, if you find it useful in your classroom or with your tribes, this is all about supporting tribal sovereignty. So is that okay if she uses your documents?
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's see. There was okay, I'm going to try to figure this one out. Is there a way to redefine, I think, agriculture so that the sacred protection of the river as a livelihood can be included under agricultural use? And I think that was before you got into beneficial uses. And so I think, you know, my question from this is, you know, if the state of Wyoming used the treaty against the tribe, can that still happen? That was another question that we had. You know, can states still sue tribes, or do all of these have to go to federal court?
States on water can still drag us into their courts, but I think in a lot of these other actions, tribes need to start initiating some of these actions first in federal court. And in some cases, I even think we should be initiating some of these actions in our own tribal court. Let's exercise our sovereignty. If other governments can have court, we got them, let's start making some decisions on some of these issues. You know, the overall imbalance is really, you know, when we're talking about food sovereignty and bringing our river back to life, you know, that riparian habitat is a critical component of our healing and our nutrition and our protection. And so we got to start developing bioregions along our rivers. We all need to be doing that. What's there? What do we need to protect? What's helping us? And so that's an important part of this code through those purposes. And then we actually outline the duties of the water board and the tribal water engineer in our code, so they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. So I hope a lot of you get a chance to read through that code. You know, our Wind River code, I think, is 19 pages. And if you go through the Wyoming water code, you're probably looking at 1,900 pages, but maybe not that much, but 200 or 300 pages at least.
I cannot thank you enough for sharing all of this knowledge and your passion for, tribal sovereignty. As you said in your presentation, I think it is just, critical that people understand tribal sovereignty, especially tribal members and tribal councils, so that things can be changed, hopefully in the future, with the tribes being elevated and their voices being elevated. So I just thank you so much for sharing. Folks, it looks like there was an issue with the link for the feedback, but I think it's been fixed. But make sure you do fill out that feedback form, whether you're seeking professional development units or not. We really, really want to know, how we did and what we can do better. So please, fill those out. And I share all of your feedback anonymously with the presenters, so they get to see it as well. So stay well. Join us on Thursday for Senator Morjo and more tribal sovereignty. I am so excited about the rest of this series. Everyone, I'm just learning so much, and I hope that you are all too. Stay warm, stay safe, and thank you, everybody.
Stay safe, everybody. Aho.